What would it take for the world's most powerful country to declare a national security emergency over an island of just 9.6 million people? And why would Washington decide that Cuba, a country with no nuclear weapons, no major military reach, and a shrinking economy, now constitutes an unusual and extraordinary threat to the United States?
Are you trying to choke off Cuba?
Cuba is a failing nation, and you have to feel badly for Cuba. And no, I'm not trying to, but it looks like it's something that's just not going to be able to survive.
In January 2026, President Donald Trump signed an executive order declaring a national emergency with respect to Cuba. The order established a new process to impose tariffs on any country that sells or provides oil to the island. It authorized key cabinet officials to determine punitive measures against foreign exporters whose oil shipments help keep Cuba running. The justification was stark. The Cuban government's actions were described as an unusual and extraordinary threat to U.S. national security and foreign policy. At first glance, the move seemed disproportionate. Cuba is a nation of just 9.6 million people. Its economy has been shrinking for years. It is not a rising superpower or a technological rival. Yet Washington escalated dramatically, targeting not only Havana, but also third countries that dare to supply it with energy. To understand why, one must look at three overlapping forces: national security calculations, geopolitical opportunity, and domestic political incentive. The executive order framed Cuba as a hub of malign influence. U.S. officials pointed to Havana's alignment with adversarial powers, including Russia, China, and Iran. Cuba was accused of hosting foreign military and intelligence capabilities, including what has been described as Russia's largest overseas signals intelligence facility, focused on the United States. The administration also cited alleged ties to groups such as Hezbollah and Hamas, and accused the Cuban government of undermining regional stability in the Western Hemisphere. In Washington's view, this was not merely an ideological dispute. It was a matter of proximity and history. Since the rise of Fidel Castro in 1959, Cuba's communist government has stood as a symbolic and strategic irritant to the United States. The tension reached its most dangerous moment during the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the world came to the brink of nuclear war. For more than 6 decades, successive American presidents have sought to isolate, pressure, or reform the Cuban regime through sanctions and embargoes. The trade embargo, in place since 1962, has shaped every aspect of Cuba's modern economy. It has limited access to financial markets, restricted trade, and deterred foreign investment. Periodic attempts at thawing relations have come and gone. President Barack Obama pursued normalization, easing travel and diplomatic restrictions. President Trump, during his first term, reversed many of those measures, arguing they failed to secure meaningful political reforms. In his second term, the strategy became sharper and more punitive. In June 2025, partial travel restrictions were imposed on Cuban nationals. A national security presidential memorandum strengthened the overall policy framework toward Havana. By early 2026, the administration was prepared to go further, leveraging tariffs against third countries to choke off Cuba's most critical vulnerability: oil. Energy is the lifeblood of the Cuban state. Much of the island's electricity generation depends on oil-fired power plants. Yet Cuba produces very little crude of its own and relies heavily on imports. For years, Venezuela served as its principal benefactor, supplying tens of thousands of barrels per day at preferential rates. That arrangement ended abruptly when U.S. military action in January 2026 removed Venezuelan leader Nicolas Maduro from power, severing a key economic artery. With Venezuelan shipments halted, Cuba turned to other suppliers. In 2025, smaller shares of oil came from Algeria, Russia, and Mexico. But under the new executive order, even those flows were threatened. Washington warned that any country directly or indirectly providing oil to Cuba could face additional tariffs on goods entering the U.S. market. The immediate effect was dramatic. No foreign oil tankers arrived in Cuban ports for weeks. Maritime tracking experts reported a near-total halt in deliveries. Airlines were informed that long-haul flights would not be able to refuel on the island. Fuel distribution companies began limiting sales, in some cases restricting purchases to dollars and capping volumes per user. Across Cuba, the lights began to flicker and then go dark. Rolling blackouts shut down schools, businesses, and even state media broadcasts. In some areas, the loss of electricity also meant no running water, as more than 80% of water pumping equipment depends on electric power. Public transport was slashed. Taxi fares spiked overnight. Universities moved classes online. Cultural events were suspended. Bank hours were reduced. Tourism, traditionally Cuba's second-largest source of foreign currency, began to collapse. Several hotels closed due to low occupancy and fuel rationing. Airlines such as Air Canada suspended flights, sending empty planes to retrieve stranded passengers. Russian carriers adjusted schedules, operating return-only flights to evacuate tourists. Governments advised their citizens against travel to the island. The disappearance of visitors struck at the heart of the economy. Tourism revenue pays for imports of food, medicine, and fuel. Approximately 300,000 Cubans depend directly on the sector for their livelihoods. The industry had already suffered a 70% revenue decline between 2019 and 2025 due to the pandemic. Now it faced what experts described as a potentially disastrous year. Healthcare services came under strain. According to the United Nations, oil scarcity jeopardized intensive care units, emergency rooms, and the storage of temperature-sensitive medicines. Water and sanitation systems were compromised by power outages. The UN Human Rights Office expressed deep concern about the impact on basic rights, warning that prolonged sectoral sanctions risk broad and indiscriminate harm to the population. High Commissioner Volker Turk called for lifting unilateral measures that have sweeping humanitarian consequences. The UN's position underscored a central tension. While the United States framed its actions as necessary to counter a hostile regime, international observers worried about the collateral damage inflicted on ordinary Cubans. Mexico responded with a delicate balancing act. President Claudia Sheinbaum publicly criticized sanctions that harm civilians and sent 2 Navy ships carrying more than 800 tons of humanitarian aid, including milk, rice, beans, and hygiene supplies. At the same time, Mexico sought diplomatic engagement with Washington to avoid punitive tariffs on its own exports. Russia signaled potential assistance as well. The Kremlin accused the United States of attempting to suffocate Cuba and indicated that oil and petroleum products might be supplied as humanitarian aid. However, Moscow also emphasized that it sought constructive dialogue with Washington and wished to avoid escalation. Havana denounced the U.S. measures as an energy blockade and an act of economic aggression. Foreign Minister Bruno Rodriguez accused Washington of trying to break the political will of the Cuban people. President Miguel Díaz-Canel warned that the blockade affected transportation, hospitals, schools, tourism, and food production. Yet Cuban officials also rolled out a survival plan, rationing fuel to essential services, protecting agriculture, prioritizing healthcare, and ensuring foreign currency generation through exports like cigars. An ambitious plan to plant 200,000 hectares of rice was announced to reduce import dependence. Renewable energy and even animal power were emphasized for agricultural tasks in the face of fuel shortages. The government pledged to keep primary schools open and maintain emergency medical services. Still, the structural weaknesses were stark. Decades of sanctions had limited Cuba's access to capital and credit. Aging infrastructure, hurricane damage, corruption, and economic mismanagement compounded the crisis. The new U.S. measures did not create these vulnerabilities, but they intensified them at a moment when the country was already on its knees. Why, then, did Washington choose this moment to escalate? From the administration's perspective, timing created leverage. With Venezuelan support cut off and Cuba's oil reserves dwindling to weeks' worth of supply, the regime appeared fragile. President Trump publicly suggested that Cuba was ready to fall. By tightening the economic grip, the White House may have calculated that sustained pressure could force political concessions or even regime change. There is also a domestic political dimension. Florida is home to a large and politically active Cuban American community, particularly in areas such as Little Havana in South Florida. For many Cuban American exiles and their descendants, the revolution represented a loss of property, status, and homeland. Hostility toward the Cuban government remains a powerful political force. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, the son of Cuban immigrants, built much of his political career on opposition to the Cuban regime. His background places him at the center of both U.S. foreign policy and the emotional landscape of Cuban American politics. A tough stance on Havana resonates strongly with segments of Florida's electorate, a state that has played an outsized role in presidential elections. Yet symbolism does not change geography. Cuba remains 90 miles from Florida. Any destabilization risks migration surges, humanitarian emergencies, and regional ripple effects. The UN has warned that prolonged hardship can fuel social disruption. Already, many Cubans rely on remittances from abroad to survive. If economic conditions deteriorate further, the pressure to leave could intensify. The administration has insisted that its objective is not to harm the Cuban people, but to confront a regime it views as repressive and aligned with U.S. adversaries. It has left open the possibility of modifying measures if Havana or affected countries take significant steps to address U.S. concerns. But for now, the policy is unmistakably coercive. Cuba, meanwhile, faces a narrowing set of options. It can seek alternative suppliers willing to risk U.S. retaliation. It can deepen ties with Russia or other partners. It can attempt internal reforms to boost productivity and renewable energy, or it can pursue negotiations with Washington, though on terms that preserve its political system. In the end, the question is not only why the United States is pushing Cuba to the brink of collapse, but what comes next. Is this a calculated strategy to force reform, a gamble on regime change, or a high-stakes assertion of national security doctrine? And if the pressure succeeds in toppling the government, what replaces it? Stability is not guaranteed by collapse. History has shown that Cuba can endure extraordinary hardship. It has survived embargoes, the end of Soviet subsidies, and repeated economic shocks. Whether it can withstand this latest squeeze remains uncertain. What is clear is that the United States has chosen escalation at a moment of maximum vulnerability. As fuel tanks empty and lights flicker across Havana, the struggle between Washington and Havana enters a new phase, one defined not by missiles or invasion, but by energy, economics, and endurance. Whether this strategy will reshape Cuba or simply deepen the suffering of its people is a question that the coming months will answer.